Okay, so I figure we may as well, as usual, just go ahead and get started since we're all here. Right. So, first response papers are graded. Feedback is posted. Everybody's seen it? Okay, yeah, and overall, yeah, actually, really good job on these. I think both of these actually showed really strong readings and a lot of potential. So let's just keep that momentum up. Now, does anybody have any questions before we get started about anything coming forward, about any assignments or anything like that? Okay, great. Then let's talk about Beowulf. So how did the second half go for you guys? What did you think? What do you want to talk about?
I think it was a better climax, all things considered. Like the first half of the poem, it's a climax of just action. There's no emotional upbringing to it. You have the guy walks in there, a high roller, and just kills Grendel, and then follows up with Grendel's mom, and there's no big emotional change coming from that.
Okay.
In the second half, you have the old, weathered man, and he has no heir. All his men leave him except for one guy.
Yep.
And he has this big final battle, and then unfortunately he dies at the end.
Yeah.
And then everything is in ruin now because of that. That the ends almost don't justify the means at that point.
And yeah, let's talk about how Beowulf as a character is different than in this final battle than he is in that earlier battle. For one, he's 50 years older, right? So, we're talking about a man who is at the very least in his late 60s, right? And he's going to go and take on a dragon more or less by himself. So on the one hand, right, we've got an old man now daring to do one final deed. And yeah, it is interesting here as well that apart from one guy, the entire warband leaves him, right? They all run away. They're all afraid to fight. And I think that, we can compare this. He's got roughly the same number of companions in the final episode that he had at the beginning, right? He had a total of, including himself, 15 men when he went to Denmark. Two of those guys get eaten by monsters, right? So in a remarkable feat of parallelism, we have, when he sets out to fight the dragon, a party of 13 men, right, including himself and the thief who stole the cup, who's acting as their guide, right? Now, how else is Beowulf different? So this is actually something that remains more or less the same, right? So you've got a consistent number of companions. And in both battles, overall, how useful are his companions?
Not very useful.
Not very. He does all the heavy lifting, right? With the exception of Wiglaf in the final battle, right? Yes?
He was talking about he was older, he was going into this final battle, and how everything just kind of falls apart. Could we say that Beowulf is what's holding back that chaos? Because he does, and chaos erupts. You have wailing, you have moaning, you have fear of Swedes invading. Power struggle over who will rule next.
Going
back. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it turns out that the Geats have pissed a lot of people off, right? The Frisians are mad at them. The Swedes are mad at them. There are all these old feuds, that Beowulf was holding at bay that are going to now come back to bite them, right? Much like, Hrothgar marrying his daughter off to Ingeld in the first half of the poem, right? Beowulf predicts that that's going to lead to strife, right? That the Danes and the Heathobards are going to come to blows over it again, right? That it's just going to reignite the old feud rather than healing it. So yeah, all of these old feuds are going to come back to bite him. And so he's the one thing holding him back. But if we think about, again, how Beowulf is an old man here at the end of the poem, is different in status from where he was at the beginning of the poem. What was he at the beginning of the poem?
The swords.
A thing.
Yeah, he's just a thane, right? A swordsman, a warrior, right? He's not responsible really for anyone but himself and maybe the 14 men he leads, right? Is that still the case now that he's an old man?
No.
He's the king now, yeah. He's responsible for keeping the Geats safe and prosperous. So his responsibilities now lie far beyond himself and his own warband, or his own hand-picked bodyguard. So, in one sense, it's incredibly brave for him to go off and try to hold off this force of chaos, right, basically on his own. He tells all the men to go wait for him, right? But on the other hand, one old king with no heirs going off to fight a dragon by himself, it's also pretty damn irresponsible, right? So he's trying to repeat that earlier act of heroism, but doing so, at a moment where the stakes are a lot higher for his people. Right? If he had failed to defeat Grendel and Grendel's mother, then they would continue to come snatch a warrior or two at night from here, right? The Geats would not have collapsed as a result. In this case, yeah, the omens are not good for Beowulf's people. And if we look at one of these signs here that things are not well and are not going to be well, what's one of the first things that brings the dragon to Beowulf's attention? What happens if we look around line 23, 25?
The thief steals a cup.
Okay, the thief steals a cup, right? That doesn't necessarily affect Beowulf, though, right?
No.
I mean, except that it's what woke the dragon up in the first place. If we look below that, right? After the dragon is belching out flames and burning bright homesteads, right? Then Beowulf was given bad news, a hard truth. His own home, the best of buildings, had been burnt to a cinder, the throne room of the Geats. It threw the hero into deep anguish and darkened his mood. The wise man thought he must have thwarted ancient ordinance of the eternal Lord, broken his commandment. Now, if all of these homesteads are getting burned, right, why would the specific burning of Beowulf's throne hall be a bad omen?
Because it threatens his stance as a leader.
Yeah, it's the seat of his authority, right? Yeah, his throne hall, his mead hall, has been destroyed. And thus, are the implications bad just for him?
Bad for his people.
Yeah, this is the community center, right? So the dragon, before Beowulf has even gone to fight it, has already done something that threatens the bonds of community, right? Now, what if we look at the dragon? How is the dragon a different kind of foe from Grendel and Grendel's mother?
He's capable of a whole lot more.
Okay, yeah, on the one hand, yeah, the dragon is capable of a good deal more destruction, right?
More direct.
Yeah, and what does the dragon destroy rather than people?
Resources.
Yeah, the dragon doesn't show up in the night and eat people. The dragon is a destroyer of farms and homesteads. Right, as such, it is a bigger and more generalized threat. It threatens people's homes. It threatens their ability to grow food, right? So it would be the responsibility then of a good king to go out and face it, to do something about it. What else is weird about the dragon, at least when compared to Grendel and Grendel's mother?
It has no humanistic, there's no human qualities.
Yeah, good.
It's just a complete monster.
Yeah, there's no indication that the dragon is in any way related to humanity. I remember reading something where like some eccentric scholar somewhere determined that last survivor of the vanished people who buried the treasure turns into the dragon. That kind of sounds like bullshit to me, given that the poem specifically tells us that guy buries everything and then just goes off wandering, right? And yeah, there's no indication given that the dragon has any human qualities other than perhaps greed, right? Yeah, Grendel and his mother are specifically given this line of descent from Cain. The dragon is not. The dragon is a distinctly non-human foe. Good. What else?
It would travel looking for hoards of gold to sleep on. It would sleep on for centuries.
Yeah, it's been asleep for 300 years, right?
And then all of a sudden, this measly little thief
Yeah.
steals one cup and he wakes up and sees
Uh-huh.
the footprints and loses it.
Yeah. So what quality then can we attribute to the dragon? Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
Sorry, I just wanted to make an aside. So that definitely would like directly translate to why Tolkien would want that sort of thing in The Hobbit, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, Bilbo's, and we'll talk about this more when we read The Hobbit, right? But yeah, Bilbo's first little venture into the dragon's lair where he riddles with Smaug and steals the cup is, yeah, it's inspired by this episode from Beowulf. Although Bilbo is, of course, in the role of the thief rather than the role of Beowulf. For reasons, again, that we'll get to when we talk about The Hobbit. But, there are direct lines of influence here. In fact, according to the story, Tolkien first conceived the idea for The Hobbit, or at least the first line of the novel, while he was, bored after marking, high school exams for extra money, which would have been, of course, like in Anglo-Saxon, right, his own specialist subject. So, of course, this would be the thing he would have been thinking about. Yeah, good. So the dragon sleeps upon this pile of hoarded gold, right? And let's think about this idea of hoarding gold in the context of Anglo-Saxon society, right? What are you supposed to do with gold and with treasure?
Distribute it amongst
Yeah.
the community.
Yeah, you're not supposed to just bury it and hoard it, right? You're supposed to give it away. You're supposed to use it to purchase the loyalty of your followers, right? Or to guarantee the loyalty of your followers. So the dragon is a gold gatherer, right? The dragon hoards and keeps resources for itself, and then goes around destroying homesteads, destroys other kinds of resources, right? So it's really kind of like the opposite of what a good king ought to be. And I think it's probably a good idea if we turn to look at the motivation of the person who buried the treasure in the first place, the way all this is described. So let's see. Where the hell is it?
Long ago, a hoard was hidden in the Earth House by the last survivor, I forgot the name.
Yeah.
On page 153, that was in the margin.
Right. Here we go. Okay, so they're right. There's this bit a few lines above where the manuscript is damaged. Right. The intruder who broached the dragon's treasure, starting around line 22-21, and moved him to wrath, had never meant to. It was desperation on the part of a slave, fleeing the heavy hand of some master, guilt-ridden on the run, going to ground. But he soon began to shake with terror. In shock, the wretch panicked and ran away with the precious metalwork. We'll talk about why there are these ellipses here in a minute, too, when we talk a little bit about the manuscript. There were many other heirlooms heaped inside the earth house, because long ago, with deliberate care, somebody now forgotten had buried the riches of a high-born race in this ancient cache. Death had come and taken them all in times gone by, and the only one left to tell their tale, the last of their line, could look forward to nothing but the same fate for himself. He foresaw that his joy in the treasure would be brief. Does this sound familiar? Yeah, the whole this last survivor, right? So we've got this treasure buried essentially by Eureka, right? A newly constructed barrow stood waiting on a wide headland close to the waves, its entryway secured. Into it, the keeper of the hoard had carried all the goods and golden ware worth preserving. His words were few. Now, earth, hold what earls once held and heroes can no more. It was mine from you first by honorable men. My own people have been ruined in war. One by one they went down to death, looked their last on sweet life in the hall. I am left with nobody to bear a sword or burnish plated goblets, put a sheen on the cup. The companies have departed. The hard helmet, hasped with gold, will be stripped of its hoops, and the helmet shiner who should polish the metal of the war mask sleeps. The coat of mail that came through all fights, through shield collapse and cut of sword, decays with the warrior. Nor may the webbed mail range far and wide on the warlord's back beside his mustered troops. No trembling harp, no tuned timbre, no tumbling hawk swerving through the hall, no swift horse pawing the courtyard. Pillage and slaughter have emptied the earth of entire peoples. And so he mourned as he moved about the world, deserted and alone, lamenting his unhappiness day and night, until death's flood brimmed up in his heart. So there are a couple of things in this speech that he gives here that I want to notice. So let's focus on this bit around line 2253 first, right? He says, I am left with nobody to bear a sword or burnish plated goblets, put a sheen on the cup. The companies have departed. Why does he pair these two things together? Both bearing a sword and burnishing plated goblets.
He's completely alone. He has no one to bear a sword to fight with him or offer him a polished cup or plate, burnished plate.
Yeah, we've got like the two sides here of life with life and the kin, right? On the one hand, you've got your war companions, right? But they're also your drinking buddies. You fight together and you feast together. And when they're gone, you've no one with which to do either, right? Now let's also have a quick look at what's happening when he starts describing the objects he's burying. The hard helmet hasped with gold will be stripped of its hoops, and the helmet shiner who should polish the metal of the war mask sleeps. The coat of mail that came through all fights, through shield collapse and cut of sword, decays with the warrior. Nor may webbed mail range far and wide on the warlord's back beside his mustered troops. No trembling harp, no tomb timber, no tumbling hawk swerving through the hall, no swift horse pawing the courtyard. What's going on here?
It's gone.
What's that?
It's gone.
Decay.
Yeah, it's all decaying, right? And why is it decaying?
Lack of use and care.
Yeah, these objects are meaningless without a human being to use them, right? So there's this notion here that use is what gives these things meaning. I don't know if either of you have ever seen the old Conan the Barbarian movie from the early 80s with Arnold Schwarzenegger and James Earl Jones.
That's actually one I've always wanted to watch. You just can't find it on the random websites.
Well, there's a great scene where it's about halfway through the movie where James Earl Jones, who plays the villain, answers the riddle of steel for Conan. You know, he says, essentially what he tells him is, that steel isn't strong, flesh is strong. What is the sword compared to the hand that wields it? And I think there's a similar thing going on here, both in the way these objects are described as useless without anyone to wear them or wield them, and in the fact that Beowulf himself fights best bare-handed, right? So, what tends to happen to Beowulf when he does try to hit something with a sword?
He breaks the sword.
Yeah, he hits it so hard the sword breaks, right? No cutting edge serves him in battle. But I think that this is also an indication, at least like during his fight with the dragon, that fate is about to catch up with him, right? So let's go to the place where he first is failed by the sword. Can I get a volunteer, either of you, to start reading around line 2574? Like, that final day was the first time when Beowulf fought. Should be near the bottom of the page.
173.
Oh, yeah. That final day was the first time when Beowulf fought and fate denied him. Glory in battle, so the king of the Geats raised his hand and struck hard at the enameled scales, but scarcely cut through. The blade flashed and slashed, yet the blow was far less powerful than the hard-pressed king. He had need of, at that moment, the Mount Keeper went into a spasm and spouted deadly flames. When he felt the stroke, battle fire billowed and spewed. Beowulf was foiled of a glorious victory. The glittering sword, infallible before that day, failed when he unsheathed it, as it never should have. For the son of Ecgtheow, it was no easy thing to have to give ground like that and go unwillingly to inhabit another home. In a place beyond, so every man must yield the leasehold of his days.
Okay, so that last line there, right? So every man must yield the leasehold of his days. What's the notion that's being repeated here that we remember from those elegies, from the Wanderer and the Seafarer?
Everything dies.
Yeah.
Everything must die.
Transience, right? Everything must die. And so the metaphor here is what? Like, what is life being compared to?
Something you, every man must yield the lease of his days, like, something you rent.
Yeah.
You only own it, you don't fully own it.
Yeah, it's not really yours, and whoever or whatever does own it is going to take it back eventually, right? It's only yours temporarily. So yeah, the idea is life is something that you borrow or rent from fate, from Weird, right? And our indication that Weird is catching up with Beowulf here, right? This is a guy who's been lucky in every other battle encounter he's ever had, right? You know, we've just seen a few pages before where he was the only one to get home from the battle with the Frisians, right? He was the only survivor. And not only is he the only survivor, but he manages to swim home across the North Sea carrying 30 coats of mail, right? So, you know, this dude has been lucky thus far, right? So for his sword to finally fail him is significant. This is the sign that this is the end for him. And then the second stroke with the sword, it breaks, right? Driving home that point that, this is it for you. You're not going to beat this thing alone, and you're not going to survive this battle. So, what do you make of the behavior of his warriors here?
Highglass, and I mean, if I had to pick, look, if someone had to inherit the Geats, I would say Highglass, because he's like, he stays with them, he sticks with it, and when it's all said and done, he rebukes the rest. He said, "You abandoned the man who gave you food, shelter, and gold."
Yeah. Yeah, you abandoned the ring giver, right? The loaf guardian. You ran off into the woods because you were shitting your armor, right? And indeed, like one thing that we know, again, like from the life of Beowulf, right? I'm sorry, what were you going to say?
Wasn't Highglass the youngest out of the group?
He's the youngest, yeah, and he's also not really related to the others either.
But he showed more, I think it does say later on, he showed more kinship
Yeah.
to Beowulf.
And indeed, like, he when we're given his lineage, right, his father is an exile who had been taken in by Beowulf's uncle, right? So Wiglaf shows more gratitude than any of these other men do, right? Who are perhaps closer kin to Beowulf. So we have here, throughout the poem, we have these kind of competing narratives regarding, the exile and the wisdom or lack of wisdom in taking in exiles, right? In the case of Wiglaf's father, and indeed the case of Beowulf's father, it seems to have been a good idea, right? The men in question proved themselves. But then there's this other case where one of the lords of the Geats takes in two brothers who are Swedes, and in doing so ends up taking on their feud with the Swedish king unknowingly. let me see if I can find that. And of course, now that I'm actually looking for it, don't see
Try
it.
line 2922.
2922.
It's the start of a speech about the Swedes. Nor do I expect peace or pact keeping of any sort from the Swedes.
Okay, and yeah, okay, let's actually shift gears and go here for a second. Anyway, this is where the herald who's giving news of Beowulf's death to the people is describing the problems that he sees coming. Right now, war is looming over our nation. Soon it will be known to Franks and Frisians far and wide that the king is gone. Hostility has been great among the Franks since Highglass sailed forth at the head of a war fleet into Friesland. There the Hetwara harried and attacked and overwhelmed him with great odds. The leader in his war gear was laid low, fell amongst followers. That lord did not favor his company with spoils. The Merovingian king has been an enemy to us ever since. Nor do I expect peace or pact keeping of any sort from the Swedes. Remember at Ravenswood, Ongentheow slaughtered Hæthcyn, Hrethel's son, when the Geat people in their arrogance first attacked the fierce Chofins, right? So the Geats apparently started this fight. The return blow was quickly struck by Otera's father. Old and terrible, he felled the Sea King and saved his own aged wife, the mother of Onela and of Otera, bereft of her gold rings. Then he kept hard on the heels of the foe and drove them leaderless, lucky to get away, in a desperate rout into Ravenswood. His army surrounded the weary remnant where they nursed their wounds. All through the night he howled threats at those huddled survivors, promised to axe their bodies open when dawn broke, dangle them from gallows to feed the birds. But at first light, when their spirits were lowest, relief arrived. They heard the sound of Highglass's horn, his trumpet calling as he came to find them, the hero in pursuit, at hand with troops. The bloody swath that Swedes and Geats cut through each other was everywhere. No one could miss their murderous feuding. Then the old man made his move, pulled back, barred his people in. Ongentheow withdrew to higher ground. Highglass's pride and prowess as a fighter were known to the earl. He had no confidence that he could hold out against that horde of seamen, defend wife and the ones he loved from the shock of the attack. He retreated for shelter behind the earth wall. Then Highglass swooped on the Swedes at bay. His banners swarmed into their refuge as Geat forces drove forward to destroy the camp. There, in his gray hairs, Ongentheow was cornered, ringed around with swords. And it came to pass that the king's fate was in Eofor's hands and his alone. Wulf, son of Onred, went for him in anger, split him open so that blood came spurting from under his hair. The old hero still did not flinch, but parried fast, hit back with a harder stroke. The king turned and took him on. Then Wonred's son, the brave Wulf, could land no blow against the aged lord. Ongentheow divided his helmet so that he buckled and bowed his bloody head and dropped to the ground, but his doom held off. Though he was cut deep, he recovered again. With his brother down, the undaunted Eofor, Highglass Thane, hefted his sword and smashed murderously at the massive helmet past the lifted shield, and the king collapsed. The shepherd of people was sheared of life. Many then hurried to help Wulf, bandaged and lifted him, now that they were left masters of the blood-soaked battleground. One warrior stripped the other, looted Ongentheow's iron mailcoat, his hard sword hilt, his helmet too, and carried the graith to King Highglass. He accepted the prize, promised fairly that reward would come, and kept his word. For their bravery in action, when they arrived home, Eofor and Wulf were overloaded by Hrethel's son, Highglass the Great, with gifts of land and linked rings that were worth a fortune. They had won glory, so there was no gainsaying his generosity, and he gave Eofor his only daughter to bide at home with him in honor and a bond. So this is a long digression, right? But there are a couple of important points made in it, right? First off, why do they focus so much here on Ongentheow's old age and how hard he fought?
Emphasize how great of a leader he was.
Yeah, and so then what are the implications of that for the Geats now that Beowulf's gone?
We're screwed.
Yeah, it's like, remember how hard these fuckers fought, right? And that was when we were protected by a legitimate king, right? Which is again, remembered when Highglass takes the spoils that his men have won and distributes them fairly, right? But yeah, the other thing too, like it's important what Ongentheow is doing to the surviving Geat warriors when he has them trapped in the woods, right? All through the night, he howled threats at those huddled survivors, promised to axe their bodies open when dawn broke, dangled them from gallows to feed the birds, right? So there's a constant reminder to the survivors here, right, of the threat that lurks outside their safe little circle. This is exactly the kind of threat that the Geats but this is exactly the situation the Geats are now in again, right? These enemies are prowling around the circle, threatening them with the gallows. Did you think there was anything odd about what's done with the dragon's treasure? Where does most of it end up?
Didn't they leave it with Beowulf in his grave?
Yeah. They put some of it on the pyre with him, right? And then most of the rest they bury with him in the barrow. Anything seem odd about that?
It wasn't distributed.
Yeah. Now, granted, what's one good reason it might not have been distributed?
Because
Yeah.
that's how all the trouble started.
Yeah. Well, and also the warriors didn't help, right?
Beowulf did say to Windcraft, go and get your piece.
Yeah. But the rest buried with me.
Yeah.
And I think there's an interesting contrast here if we look at the two funerals that bookend the poem, right? If we remember from the beginning, what did Shield Chieftain's funeral look like?
They sent him down the river with all his winnings.
Yeah, he has a ship funeral. They put him in a boat. They put a bunch of war gear around him, right? They put some treasure in the boat with him, and then they send him off to wherever, right? What's done with Beowulf's body?
It's burned.
Yeah, Beowulf is cremated on a funeral pyre. And then what's left of him and of the treasure is buried in a barrow. What's the difference, or why do you think this matters?
One of them left a legacy while the other didn't.
Yeah. All Beowulf ends up leaving behind is ashes. Whereas Shield founds a dynasty that will carry on his legacy. Beowulf is too concerned with personal immortality, right? Leaving that barrow behind as a permanent reminder of who he was and how great he was, right? So let's look at the directions he gives for the building of it. Which, once again, I have to remind myself where the hell it is.
Or is the construction of a commemorate him? 2790.
Oh, yeah, okay.
2794.
Yes, right. As the beginnings of an utterance broke out from the king's breast cage, The old lord gazed sadly at the gold. To the everlasting Lord of all, to the King of glory I give thanks that I behold this treasure here in front of me, that I have been allowed to leave my people so well endowed on the day I die. Now that I have bartered my last breath to own this fortune, it is up to you to look after their needs. I can hold out no longer. Order my troop to construct a barrow on a headland on the coast after my pyre has cooled. It will loom on the horizon at Hronesness and be a reminder among my people, so that in coming times crews under sail will call it Beowulf's Barrow, as they steer ships across the wide and shrouded waters. You can't do this if you have a ship funeral, right? There is no permanent marker to you if people just put you out in a boat and send you off to sea, right? Which, by the way, is the way I have asked my wife to dispose of my remains when I pass. Mostly because I feel like it would be an enormous pain in the ass to anyone who survives me.
It's also super illegal.
Yeah, I imagine that the permitting would be would be a bitch too. Well, but you know that's you know part of the appeal, right? Is the difficulty level.
I'm gonna be reading newspapers saying retired English professor body found at sea. I'm like, yep, that was Dr. Moore.
Oh no, you're also supposed to set the boat on fire. But in Shield's case, that's not done. Shield's boat is not set afire. He was just sent out adrift under the waves, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, Beowulf seems determined to make this permanent mark on the landscape where he can continue to watch over his people, right? So what is he not really accepting then?
He's dead.
Yeah, he's not really accepting the transient nature of existence, right? Right, by clinging to earthly influence in some form. Now, I don't know how, I know that you guys have some familiarity with Norse mythology, we've talked about this before. Are any of you familiar with a creature from Norse myth called a draugr?
It's a vampire.
Essentially, yeah. And the dragon is rather closely related to this kind of creature, right? A draugr is essentially is a buried human corpse, right? That guards a treasure, right? They form because they're too deeply attached to some worldly object. Now, in mythology, they're not all villainous necessarily. Some of them never leave their barrows, right? Others leave the barrow to go and threaten nearby homesteads, things like that. The draugr is defined by its connection to what's in that barrow, whatever grave goods it's guarding. So the dragon is, again, very closely related to this concept. And even Beowulf's own burial suggests that kind of future, right? Now, I don't want to go too far and say, Beowulf is definitely, supposed to be a reference to the draugr, right? But I think that, there's this suggestion that that's a possibility here. Especially given that we have seen the king behave selfishly in pursuit of his own glory at various points. Right? The more, it's not so much that he wants to amass goods as that he wants to amass reputation, right? Right. The more famous he is, the better. But what is the fact that Beowulf goes it alone so much also means what regarding his men?
He doesn't have a lot of faith in them.
Well, he probably doesn't, because he tells them to go stand aside while I handle this, right?
Yeah. He doesn't trust them.
Yeah.
Like, I don't trust you enough to do this. I'll just do it myself.
And there has to be, for a kin relationship to function, right, there has to be a mutual trust between the Lord and the members of the kin, right? right? And if Beowulf is always hogging all the glory, and if we think about this in like Dungeons and Dragons terms, basically hogging all the experience points, right? It means that the other guys aren't developing, right? He's not making room for another leader to emerge and develop. And when one does, finally of his own volition, Wiglaf, right? He's inheriting kind of stunted kingdom. Because the little maples never got to grow big in the shade of the big oak, right?
Yep. But you could also look at it, he purposely kept him that way so no one could challenge him. He's older, doesn't move as quickly, probably a little forgetful, and he doesn't want there to be any question to his competency as a leader.
And he's definitely favored by Weird, right? You know, he comes through most conflicts unscathed. But yeah, his unwillingness to let other people take on these kinds of roles, let other people join the fight, right, is a big part of the problem that he's leaving the Geats with. I think is kind of like, you know, the lines along which we're both speaking here now, right? So let's look at the final lament that is made for him.
Was it the Geat woman?
Yeah. Let's go to the pyre. So Nick read before. Can you read, Ashlyn, for us, starting with the Geat people built a pyre?
The Geat people built a pyre for Beowulf, stacked and decked until it stood 4 square, hung with helmets, heavy war shields, and shining armor, just as he had ordered. Then his warriors laid him in the middle of it, mourning a lord far famed and beloved. On a height they kindled the hugest of all funeral fires. Fumes of wood smoke billowed darkly up. The blaze roared and drowned out their weeping. Wind died down, and flames wrought havoc in the hot bone house, burning it to the core. They were disconsolate and wailed aloud for their lord's decease. A Geat woman too sang out in grief. With hair bound up, she unburdened herself of her worst fears. A wild litany of nightmare and lament, her nation invaded, enemies on the rampage, bodies in piles, slavery and abasement. Heaven swallowed the smoke.
Yeah, you keep going.
Then the Geat people began to construct a mound on a headland, high and imposing, a marker that sailors could see from far away, and in 10 days they had done the work. It was their hero's memorial. What remained from the fire they housed inside it, behind a wall, as worthy of him as their workmanship could make it. And they buried...
You can do it.
Torques and the barrow and jewels and a trove of such things as trespassing men had once dared to drag from the Lord. They let the ground keep that ancestral treasure, gold under gravel, gone to earth, as useless to men now as it ever was. Then 12 warriors rode around the tomb, chieftain sons, champions in battle, all of them distraught, chanting in dirges, mourning his loss as a man and a king. They extolled his heroic nature and exploits, and gave thanks for his greatness, which was the proper thing. For a man should praise a prince whom he holds dear, and cherish his memory when that moment comes, when he has to be convoyed from his godly home. So the Geat people, his hearth companions, sorrowed for the lord who had been laid low. They said that of all the kings upon the earth, he was the man most gracious and fair-minded, kindest to his people, and keenest to win fame.
Okay, so what's the last thing that's said about it? The absolute last thing that's said about him here in the poem.
He was the most gracious and fair-minded, kindest to his people, and keenest
To win fame. Yeah, that comes last, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the note that sounded here at the very end of the poem. He's keenest to win fame. And what about the treasure that's buried with him? What do we note about that? What does the poet note about that? They let the ground keep that ancestral treasure, gold under gravel, gone to earth, as useless to men now as it ever was.
So no purpose anymore.
Yeah. Never did serve any purpose, right? Gold doesn't do any good when it's buried in the ground. Right? It's not going to save the geeks. Essentially, they've done the same thing that the last survivor did with the treasure in the first place, right? He built a barrow. He dropped all the treasure into it, closed it up, and left. Which is what drew the dragon in the first place, right?
And then it kind of becomes a cycle after that.
Yeah, because it's...
Geatland's not going to last without Beowulf because there's just nobody as strong or headstrong as Beowulf. And so there will be exiles that come of that, and they'll just have to leave and find land where they're not warring with somebody else.
Yeah, the kin is going to split up, right? And, a literal dragon might not be coming to, go to land in southern Sweden to do something about these people. But there are all of these human dragons lurking around them that they've pissed off at various points who smell blood in the water and will be coming to reignite those old feuds.
And I highly doubt they're going to care about Beowulf's barrow. I mean, there's treasure for the
Yeah,
taking.
yeah,
That's what you do when you pillage.
yeah. So yeah, I want to look as well at one more thing that kind of foreshadows, I think, the situation of Beowulf and his people. It's called the Father's Lament. And now I can't locate it because I can never find things when I actually want them. Oh, right, okay, so around line 2445. He's talking about the conflicts between, or the difficulties of Highglass's father, Hrethel, whose oldest son, Heribald, is accidentally killed by his second son, Haethcyn. It was like the misery felt by an old man who has lived to see his son's body swing on the gallows. He begins to keen and weep for his boy, watching the raven gloat where he hangs. He can be of no help. The wisdom of age is worthless to him. Morning after morning, he wakes to remember that his child is gone. He has no interest in living on until another heir is born in the hall, now that his firstborn has entered death's dominion forever. He gazes sorrowfully at his son's dwelling, the banquet hall bereft of all delight, the wind-swept hearthstone. The horsemen are sleeping, the warriors underground. What was is no more. No tunes from the harp, no cheer raised in the yard. Alone with his longing, he lies down on his bed and sings a lament. Everything seems too large, the steadings in the fields. So this also prefigures the situation that the Geats are left in at the end of the poem, right? Beowulf hasn't lost a son. As far as we can tell, he's never had one. But the kingdom has been his child, essentially, right?
Yeah.
And that kingdom is going to be empty and windswept after his death, after his passing. So what questions or comments do you guys have about this? Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you guys want to talk about?
You said the drawer, they they form whenever they have an attachment to something that's so strong that it binds them to the earth.
Yeah.
So for a dragon, that's essentially wealth, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Clear that up.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going to see in the Fellowship of the Ring, the Barrow Wights are very similar to the Germanic concept of the Draugr. Okay. So do you guys have any other questions? Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about the manuscript then. We'll leave it there. We'll pick it up with Runeberg on the Battle of Alden next time. Okay. So Beowulf, as I noted last time, exists in only one copy. Right, there's one manuscript. It is half of what has come to be called the Null Codex. Named for a 17th century scholar who once owned the book. And this codex is made of two manuscripts that have been bound together. The first manuscript is more recent. Dates from the 12th century and is mostly prose, works of religious and philosophical nature. The second half of the codex is the part which contains Beowulf. And this was composed sometime between 975 and 1025. It includes Beowulf, plus several other poems which are in some way concerned with monsters. Right, that seems to be the thematic unity that unites the second half, or at least what was originally a single book here. Right, so these two manuscripts that were bound together sometime in the 16th century. So, a couple of things we can tell about Beowulf itself from looking at this manuscript. On the one hand, it's written in two separate hands. Around line 2000, the handwriting changes so significantly that it's clear that it's transcribed by two different writers, right? However, at the same time, linguistic analysis suggests that it's the work of a single poet. Right? That it's not some hybrid work that was cobbled together by multiple people, but that this is a single coherent work by one poet. So, if linguistic analysis tells us it's a single coherent work composed by one poet, but it's written in two separate scribal hands, what can we infer from that?
Whoever had wrote it had two other people, or one other person at least helping him write it.
Or at least copy it down, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, at least what scholars assume happened here is that there is an earlier lost manuscript of the poem that these two scribes were copying out, right? that they were transcribing some earlier source. They probably didn't change it, or didn't change it significantly. But yeah, they were working from some other text. So what this means is that while the Null Codex can't be any older than 975 AD, right? Beowulf is perhaps significantly older. When it comes to trying to date the poem, Tolkien himself argued for an early date, sometime in the 8th century. And the argument he made for this was that the poem contains enough residual pagan belief that it must have been written only a few generations after conversion. So the conversion of the Angles and the Saxons to Christianity occurs around the year 700. So Tolkien argued that this poem could not have been written more than about 100 years after that date. Right? That it must have been written when paganism was still part of living memory. And most linguistic analysis also favors a fairly early date of composition. That it's written in a dialect of West Saxon that would accord with a roughly 8th century, 8th or 9th century date of composition. Now, there are scholars who argue that the version of the poem we have is in fact much later. That it was a product of the 10th or 11th centuries. But again, it can't be any older than about the year 1025. And the evidence they offer for this is that they believe that what we have of Beowulf is an interpretation of older material from an explicitly Christian viewpoint. Now, I'm not an Anglo-Saxonist by training. This isn't my specialty area. I'm a modernist. But I tend to think that the arguments for earlier dates of composition are a little stronger. In part because the poem looks to me like it vacillates pretty strongly between pagan and Christian ideas, and even a lot of the ideas that sound Christian are kind of like putting a Christian word on top of a pagan concept, right? So when it talks about, the action of God the Father and all that sort of thing, it's usually very, very similar to the Germanic pagan action of weird, right? God just becomes a kind of substitute for fate. So yeah, my own opinion would be to side with those favoring an earlier date. Now, the other interesting thing about the manuscript is, so we noticed that part where the text is broken up with the ellipses, right? Like sort of near where the thief steals the cup. Does anybody know what happened there? Why we have those ellipses?
There was something written there, and it was probably lost or mistranslated.
Yes, in fact, we know exactly what happened. We know exactly why there was a break in the text. So in the early 18th century, the poem was part of the collection of a book collector, an antiquarian by the name of Robert Cotton. And in 1731, Ashburnham House in London where Cotton kept most of his collection, was ravaged by fire.
Ironic.
Yeah, isn't it?
It's called Ashburnham.
Yeah,
And,
yeah, I know. And Beowulf is burned up in a pyre, right? You know, it's yeah, it's all thematically connected, right? But this just points to us again, like just how miraculous the survival of this poem into the present really is, right? A lot of other books were lost. A lot of other books were destroyed. The Null Codex was barely damaged. Most of the damage ended up being kind of around the margins of the pages. But there were a couple of lines of Beowulf that were burned out. Now, the other interesting thing about Beowulf, and this is going to be the last interesting thing about it, is that up until the early 19th century, no one had really bothered to read this book. Like, you know, the Null Codex, you know, it had been, you know, scholars had, you know, looked at it, they'd cataloged its contents, and no one had really paid any attention to this very long Anglo-Saxon heroic poem. And it's not until the early 19th century that anyone makes any serious efforts to translate it into modern English. So it's not a poem that has wide influence in its own time or in the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance. In fact, if we look at English literature in the Renaissance, most of the major influences are classical influences, right? They're much more influenced in particular by Roman writers. But with the rise of nationalism in Europe in the 19th century, interest in these native traditions increases. And so scholars both in Britain and in Germany make efforts to start translating material like Beowulf. And so by the time, you know, J.R.R. Tolkien is a young boy in the 1890s, the early 1900s, there are existing translations of this poem. And you know, he is one of the first scholars to do any serious literary analysis of it. Okay, so I'm going to leave you guys with that. Anybody have any questions? All right, then let me give you the guide questions for the Battle of Malden and Brunanburh, both of which are about famous battles from the Anglo-Saxon period, one of which is a victory, one of which is a military debacle, and I will leave it to you to figure out which is which.